hasn't really addressed what this means for Cuban-American relations. So for folks who didn't know, in January 2013, for the first time, Cubans no longer have to get the tarjeta blanca in order to leave the island. Now, that said, most Cubans do not have the money to leave the island, but I think psychologically, the fact that they're no longer restricted from doing so is important. And it does make it easier for those who do have those resources or those opportunities to leave. We don't know what this is going to mean for migration, given US's wet foot, dry foot policy and the facility with which people could migrate. But the interesting flip side of this, that I think we haven't talked about very much as a community, is that part of that law makes it easier for those who have left to come back, both to visit or to stay. So that if you came, y te arrepentiste, and you decided it was a bad idea, you can go home in a way that you couldn't do before. And so that idea of sort of having more facility of movement back and forth, which is something that has never existed since even the triumph of the revolution, is a big change. And we have to think about, I think for the community, that's going to be, if US policy changes, that's a big adjustment on both sides. You have economic change on the island. It goes, it comes, it's this and that, but the fact of the matter is things are changing in terms of how things are structured, how things are organized, how the currency operates, all of those things. The fact that Raul announced last year that he will be stepping down from the presidency in 2018, maybe it won't happen, maybe it will, but the fact that, at least publicly, the government line is there will not be a Castro in office in Cuba for the first time since 1959, I think that's a big deal. That is a significant change. And what that means also is that you have a whole new generation of Cubans who have the opportunity to rule, right, to be in government. The folks who weren't part of the revolution, the folks who are of that second or third generation, after Castro, and what they're going to do and how they're going to imagine the future of the country, we don't really know. And the sad part is because there's no dialogue, the U.S. has no role, and the Cuban American community to a large extent has no role in shaping that future. But one can only imagine these changes are going to continue. Cuba isn't frozen in amber the way that we think about. And so the question is what that's going to mean for both sides. Personally, I think that you have this huge rupture in 1959 within this community that needs to be healed. And how that process happens is probably going to be going on over the next few decades, but that relationships between these sort of the Cubans of abroad and the Cubans on the island is going to be something that needs to be worked out. So if thinking about the future of Cuban American politics, I don't want to make the argument that was said this morning that it's that all the old people are dying off, but what is true is that their experience is no longer characteristic of what Cubans traveling to the United States have. And I think one of the student in the back mentioned that the folks who come now, the experience of exile was a very unique experience. It was a very historically situated experience that will not be repeated. And that experience gave folks a common enemy, it gave people a sense of collective purpose, it gave people a common basis of experience, which led to a very coherent political program, and which I would argue explains the high levels of engagement, the high levels of voting. It's a very unique experience, and it's a unique identity that came out of it. That is becoming diluted over time. And so the question is, what's going to take its place? What is that identity going to look like, given the changes in the people who've come, given the changes on the island, and thinking about the possibility of having normal relations between the two countries? What will that mean, for the future of Cuban American politics, and what will it mean in terms of the issues that they care about, the kinds of things that they put their emphasis on in terms of political engagement or collective action? And we don't really know what kind of normalized Cuban American politics look like, but I think it's reasonable to think that in the next few decades we're going to start moving towards that in the community. With that,
I do have one disagreement with Lisa. I think Cubans on the island and here can agree that Cuban sugar is sweeter, that the Cuban beaches are wider, that the Cuban ocean is clearer.
And you got this are this big.
Yes, and Cuban tobacco doesn't cause cancer. I like to take us a little bit into the future. And I think that what's going on in Miami today is a classic realignment. I think Cuban Americans have been, since 2008, maybe 2007, moving away from the Republican Party toward the Democratic Party. In 1980, candidate Ronald Reagan came to Miami Park, just half a mile from where we are today, and in front of 100,000 people said that the Castro regime would not survive a Reagan administration. After that speech, Cuban Americans have voted between 1980 and 2004 an average of 75.8%, something like that, for the Republican ticket, if you average it out over time. A height of 88% for Ronald Reagan's re-election, and a low of 60% when Bob Dole was our national nominee, or the Republican Party's nominee. I say "our" when I talk about Republicans. I don't know why. But in the last election, in 2012, Miami-Dade County gave President Obama a margin of 207,000 votes. That's nearly 70,000 votes more, actually over 70,000 more votes than President Obama got in 2008. So just think about it. Historic, and in 2008 it was a historic margin. He only won Florida by 70,000 votes. Actually, if you look at President Obama's numbers in Florida, he got a reduced plurality among Anglos, a tiny increase in Central Florida. The big increase was in Miami-Dade County. Something was definitely happening. I unfortunately got dragged into this debate whether Cubans voted for Obama or they voted for Romney. I really think it's irrelevant. What is relevant is, even in my figures, which was in Dade County, 54% voted for Romney, 54 to 58%. And probably if you bring in the national, the non-Florida voters, probably it was either a wash or a little bit for one side, a little bit for the other. It doesn't really matter. That the huge pluralities that Cuban voters used to give the Democrats is no longer there. It's just not there.
Republicans.
Republicans. Yeah, sorry. Republicans. Wishful thinking. How do I know this? And how do I know this is continuing? If you look at, I looked at, after the 2012 elections, I did a homogeneous precinct analysis of Miami-Dade County. Those precincts that are at least 70% Hispanic. And in those precincts, it's gone from a 30% advantage for Republican registration to tie. Basically even. I took the two most Cuban, because right, we don't know, as Professor Gamara said, we don't know national origins by looking at registration data. So I took, according to the census data, the two most Cuban city council districts, city commission districts in the city of Miami, which is the district represented by Francis Suarez and Frank Arroyo, and found out in those districts that the Republican advantage in registration has almost completely disappeared. It's now only about a 5% advantage. So again, we know that something's happening. The question, and I think the question we haven't touched on, is why is this happening? And I think there are 4 reasons for this shift in Cuban American voting. Number 1 is that the Republican Party has been running the same campaign in Miami since 1980, since Ronald Reagan. The campaign is basically, we are better on Cuba than the Democrats. First, there's not a lot of difference between the Republican Party's position on Cuba and the Democratic position on Cuba, that I can tell, right? The Democrats a little bit more on travel, but not much of a difference. And in fact, if you do a content analysis of the 3 U.S. senators, the 3 Cuban U.S. senators, the one that talks most on Cuba is the Democrat, Bob Menendez. So that issue has began to lose its salience. In 2006, Lisa and I and another colleague of ours did a poll in Miami-Dade County on Cuban attitudes on all sorts of issues. And we asked them to list, from most important to least important, what issues. The democratization of Cuba, I think, was number 10. Yeah, or lower. And it just showed that that issue, that trick pony wasn't playing anymore. And we saw it in 2008 when Obama, according to my numbers, got about 38 to 40% of the Cuban American vote, compared to Clinton in 96. The second reason is something that we've talked about all day, and that is the demographic change. Younger Cuban Americans are not as tied to the Republican Party as their parents. And many of them, in the same way that in the 1980 there was a cult of Reagan, I think among college students nationwide there was a cult of Obama. Right? I mean, you know, as Republicans, one of the things we faced up is Obama was a lot cooler than McCain or Romney, right? And you know, and it's hard to sell a candidate in Miami that doesn't drink coffee, you know, which was one of Romney's problems. I mean, you couldn't even take him to Versailles. So there was a real, I think, the generational gap and also the new arrivals gap really played in. The third, and this is something that people have brushed over. Everybody says, well, you know, the old people are still voting the way they did. They're not. There's been a 6 to 10% drop in support among Cuban Americans over 65 for the Republicans. You know, I'm 58 now, so you know the trend catches up with you. Eventually, you fall into that column. But and I think the part of the and if you want proof, look at some of the precincts in Hialeah, right? The most Republican city in Florida. Romney was only getting 58, 57%. This is areas where Dole got 70, right? And the reason for that is I believe that the extreme fiscal conservativeness of the Republican Party scared a lot of the elderly who are taking advantage of these social programs. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was eating at a McDonald's, and this elderly gentleman recognized me and came up to me and said, "Professor Moreno, aren't you afraid that Obama is turning us into a Fabian socialist country?" And I said, "Yes,